Welcome to the Sci-Fi Rancher story. Here you find the best HFY story written by human. Listen the story. If you like it, subscribe the channel.
An alien girl's tail was chained for being dangerous until a human broke her chains. Welcome to the world of science. Fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The air on Vol Station was thick with the scent of oil rust and the unmistakable stench of desperation. The slave markets were always the same, no matter the sector. Dimly lit corridors, lined with reinforced cages. Creatures of all species hunched in filth, their spirits broken long before the bidding began. The traders, grinning smugly in their tattered robes, barked out descriptions of their stock, boasting of strength, obedience, and exotic appeal to a crowd of callous buyers. Some came seeking laborers, others for warriors, and the most depraved sought something far worse. Jeremy Graves had no business being here. He wasn't a warrior, a bounty hunter, or some high-rolling crime lord looking to fill his ranks. He was an engineer, just another human trying to carve out a life in the unfeeling void of deep space. But a job had gone sideways, and in his desperate bid to scrape together enough credits to get off this cursed rock, he had ended up wandering the market, hopping for a lead. A way out. He wasn't entirely sure why he had stopped in front of this particular cage, only that something about the figure within held his attention. Like a vice, the creature, no, the woman, was unlike anything he had ever seen. She sat with her back to the iron bars, her posture tense, shoulders coiled like a predator poised to strike. Her skin was a shade of dusky violet, not in the sickly, malnourished way of some captives, but in a manner that seemed almost ethereal, as if the stars themselves had bled their color into her flesh. Her hair was dark, nearly black, falling and loose, unkempt waves around her face, though it did little to conceal the burning intensity of her glowing violet eyes. But it wasn't her face or skin, or even the subtle hint of muscle beneath the grime of captivity that had frozen Jeremy in place. It was her tail, thick, powerful, and bound in cruel iron. The prehensile limb twitched slightly against its restraints, a silent act of defiance. The metal binding it was crude, wrapped around its length in jagged, rusted bands that dug into her skin, likely ensuring she could barely move it at all. Jeremy wasn't a xenobiologist, but he had seen enough species in his travels to know when something was being restrained for a reason, and judging by the way the guards kept their distance, always casting wary glances toward the cage, it was clear that whatever this woman's tail was capable of, it terrified them. Zarian, a voice beside him, drawled thick with amusement. Jeremy turned slightly to see one of the traders, a hulking reptilian creature with a face like cracked stone and yellow teeth jutting from a permanent sneer. You won't find another like her, not in this sector. Most of her kind are long gone, wiped out after their little rebellion. But this one, she was raised in chains, never had the chance to be one of those feral beasts the old war stories talk about, trained since birth to be obedient. The traitor chuckled, a low guttural sound that made Jeremy's skin crawl. Not that it stuck. Had to break her tail early if she had her way. She'd strangle every one of us in our sleep. Jeremy felt his stomach twist at the casual cruelty in the man tone. He had heard plenty of horror stories about the treatment of slaves in the Outer Rim, but standing here, seeing it with his own eyes, was different. The Zarian woman did not react to the trader's words, though he noticed the slight tremor in her jaw, the way her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She was listening, she was feeling it all, but she had long since learned to keep her rage contained. How much the words were out before he had even thought them through, before he could consider the absolute stupid of what he was about to do. The trader cocked his head, one thick brow rising. You interested? His yellow teeth flashed again, predatory and gleeful. She's expensive, Zarian. Always are dangerous stock, hard to keep them in line. His gaze raked over Jeremy with a look of amusement. She'd get you in your sleep, human. But if you've got the credits, who am I to argue? Jeremy's heart pounded as he ran the numbers in his head. He had enough, barely. It would leave him stranded here for longer than he wanted, but the thought of walking away, of leaving her behind, was impossible now. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way she had refused to break completely, even under chains. Maybe it was the way the slavers spoke about her, as if she were nothing but a wild animal that needed to be contained. Maybe it was the simple undeniable fact that he had always been the kind of fool who couldn't turn his back on someone's suffering done, he said. Before he could second-guess himself, the trayer grinned, his tongue flicking out in satisfaction. "She's yours. Then just remember, keep that tail locked up, or it'll be the last mistake you ever make." Jeremy barely heard him. His pulse was a hammer in his ears as the credits transferred, and the thick rusted bars of the cage groaned. As they slid open, the Zarian woman didn't move at first, her gaze flicking between Jeremy and the guards who still hovered nearby, hands on their weapons. "You're free, Jeremy," said his voice low, steady. He stepped forward slowly, reaching out a cautious hand. "Come on, let's get out of here." For a long, agonizing moment, she did nothing. Then, with a slow, measured movement, she rose to her feet. Even with the weight of the change, she moved with the grace of a predator, her every motion controlled, deliberate. She stepped out of the cage, her tail still bound, but her presence no less imposing. One of the guards muttered something under his breath. Another gripped his rifle a little tighter. Jeremy felt the tension in the air shift, thick with the unspoken threat of violence. Then, without warning, she moved. It was a blur, a flicker of motion, faster than he had anticipated. Her hands snapped forward, seizing the nearest guard by the wrist and twisting sharply. There was a sickening crack, a howl of pain, and before anyone could react, she had ripped the blaster from his grasp. In the same fluid motion, she spun, leveling the weapon at the remaining guards. Jeremy's breath caught, but he didn't move. The guards hesitated, eyes flicking between each other, silently debating whether she was worth the trouble of subduing again. "Not worth it," the traitor growled, waving a dismissive hand. "Take your pet and go human before I decide to make you both my next product." Jeremy didn't need to be told twice. He turned on his heel, moving quickly toward the docking bays. The Zarian woman followed. Without a word, the stolen blaster still clutched in her hands. Only when they were well beyond the market, lost in the maze of industrial corridors, did she finally speak. "You are either very stupid or very brave, human." Her voice was quiet, rough from disuse, but there was no mistaking the underlying steel. Jeremy shot her a glance, allowing himself a half-smirk. Maybe both. She studied him for a long moment, then turned her attention back to the halls ahead. "For your sake, I hope you're more than that." They kept moving, and for the first time in her life, the weight of her chains felt just a little lighter. The small stolen transport groaned under the stress of rapid acceleration, its outdated thrusters rattling as Jeremy pushed the controls harder than the ship had been designed for. The docking clamps had barely disengaged when the slaver alarms had begun blaring, the deep, ominous wail reverberating through the station's corridors, calling every hired thug and bounty hunter within earshot to respond. He had seen the flashing indicators on his scanner. The station's automated turrets had powered up, locking onto their unauthorized departure. It hadn't been much of a ship to begin with, a rusted old cargo hauler whose best days were centuries behind it. But it was all they had, and Jeremy knew they would have exactly 30 seconds to get beyond Vorkal's range before the slavers turned them into scrap. The Zarian woman sat in the co-pilot's seat, silent, her glowing violet eyes watching his every move with an unreadable intensity. Her tail was still bound in heavy iron, but her posture was rigid, every muscle wound tight, as if she were coiled for another fight. She had yet to speak, yet to ask where they were going, yet to even acknowledge that her circumstances had fundamentally changed. He wondered how many times she had dreamed of this moment, how many nights she had stared at the cold, grimy walls of her cell and imagined the possibility of escape. And yet, now that it had happened, she was still as stone, unreadable and motionless. Jeremy barely had time to register her unreadable expression before the first warning shots streaked past their ship. The station's automated defenses had locked on, bright bolts of plasma tearing through the void, narrowly missing the hull as he twisted the controls and banked hard to the left. The inertial dampeners groaned in protest, barely keeping them from being crushed under the force of the sudden maneuver. His fingers flew over the console, routing auxiliary power to the shields, but it was a fool's game. This ship wasn't built for evasive action, and if they didn't clear the station's range in the next few moments, they never would. Jeremy swore under his breath, pushing the engines past their recommended limits, ignoring the flashing red warnings that lit up across the control panel. The ship shuddered violently, heat alarms blaring, but he refused to ease up. Another barrage of plasma fire erupted from the station, this time closer, one shot glancing off their left wing, sending a ripple of tremors through the ship's frame. The damage indicator flashed angrily, but it was still holding for now. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the firing stopped. The ship lurched as it broke free of the station's gravity. Well, the black void of open space, stretching endlessly before them. Jeremy exhaled sharply, his hands tightening on the controls, his heartbeat a deafening drum in his ears. They had made it for the first time since they had lifted off. He turned to his unlikely companion. She was still watching him, her face still set in that same impassive mask. But he could see the faintest flicker of something in her eyes, something sharp, something calculating. She had been waiting, studying him, assessing him. "You have a name?" he asked. Finally, his voice rougher than he had intended. There was a long pause before she finally spoke. "Vila." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jeremy leaned back against his seat, running a hand through his short, dark hair, trying to catch his breath. His body was still wired with adrenaline, his nerves still frayed from the reckless escape. But they weren't safe yet. He had no illusions about what had just happened. He had stolen property from one of the most ruthless slavers, syndicates in the sector, and they would not let it go unanswered. They would come for her, and by extension they would come for him. He turned his attention back to the controls, running a quick diagnostic scan of the ship systems. The damage to the left wing was minor but concerning, and he could already tell from the power readings that they were running on borrowed time. The ship's reactor was old, inefficient, and had likely seen 1,000 different owners before them, each one pushing it closer to total failure. Vea shifted slightly in her seat, and Jeremy caught the faint clink of iron as her bound tail twitched against its restraints. The sight of it unsettled him more than he was willing to admit. It wasn't just the cruelty of it, the sheer indignity of having a part of her body shackled like an uncontrollable weapon. It was the fact that it had been done to her since birth. She had never known freedom, never even had the chance. He hesitated for only a moment before he reached beneath the console, pulling out a small cutting tool from the emergency repair kit. The plasma cutter was old, its grip worn from years of use, but it would do the job. He turned back to VA, holding it out to her. "Let me cut those off." Her expression didn't change, but the sharp intensity in her gaze flickered, as if she hadn't quite expected that. She didn't move to take the tool, didn't immediately refuse, but there was something wary in the way she regarded him, as if she were weighing the consequences of trust. After a long moment, she spoke. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. He frowned, gripping the cutter a little tighter. "Because no one should live in chains." The silence stretched between them, heavy and unmoving. Then finally, she shifted forward, her movements slow and deliberate. As if she wasn't entirely sure whether to believe him, she extended her tail slightly, the iron shackle scraping against the metal floor as she placed it within reach. Jeremy wasted no time. He activated the cutter, the small focused arc of plasma flaring to life. As he carefully began slicing through the first restraint, the metal hissed under the heat, glowing a molten orange before cracking apart, falling away in broken pieces. He moved to the next one, then the next, working quickly but cautiously, aware of the way she watched him, her gaze never leaving his hands. The final shackle broke away with a dull clang, the last remnants of her captivity hitting the floor like discarded relics of a life she no longer belonged to. Vea didn't move immediately. Her tail remained still, as if uncertain of its own freedom, as if it had forgotten how to exist without the weight of iron holding it down. Then slowly she flexed it, the long, powerful limb curled slightly, stretching, testing its newfound mobility. Jeremy could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her breath hitched slightly as the reality of it sank. And she was free for the first time in her life. She was free. She exhaled sharply, her eyes closing for the briefest of moments before she turned to him, something unreadable flickering across her face. "You are either very brave," she murmured, "or very, very foolish." Jeremy offered her a wry smile, tossing the broken shackles aside. "I hear that a lot." Vea didn't smile back. Instead, she simply regarded him for another long moment. Before turning away, her newly freed tail curling loosely around the base of her seat. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something, and for now, that was enough. The ship drifted in the vast, empty void of space, its outdated engines humming softly in the background as Jeremy checked and rechecked the navigation logs, looking for the best possible place to disappear. They had bought themselves time, but not much. Slavers didn't just let stolen property vanish into the black. They hunted, they tracked, and Jeremy knew it was only a matter of time before someone came looking. The question was whether they would be ready when that moment arrived. He glanced to the side where Via sat in the co-pilot's chair, her tail now free and draped lazily over the armrest. It hadn't escaped his notice how often she shifted it, the way she ran her fingers over the now unshackled length, testing its full range of motion, as if rediscovering something long thought lost. He had never seen someone move with such calculated grace, every motion controlled, precise, yet laced with a tension that had yet to unwind. She had spent her entire life in chains. No one just let go of that in a single moment. Where do you want to go? Jeremy asked, his voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. He hadn't expected an easy answer, but it still needed to be asked. If she had family, a home world, anywhere she could go, now was the time to decide. Via's violet eyes flickered toward him, unreadable as ever before. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the distant stars outside the viewport. There is nowhere, she said finally, her tone devoid of emotion. Zans have no home, not anymore. Jeremy frowned. He had heard rumors of the Zarian War, the rebellion that had been crushed long before he was born. Their people had once been warriors, fierce and unrelenting, but when they had dared to rise up against the Galactic Order, the response had been swift and brutal. The Zarian had been declared a threat to civilization. Their worlds bombarded, their survivors enslaved or driven into hiding. He had never given it much thought before, had never needed to. But now, looking at her, seeing the weight of that truth settle over her shoulders, he realized how little the rest of the galaxy actually cared. Then we'll find somewhere, he said, turning back to the console. I know a few outposts where no one asks questions. We can lay low, figure out the next move. Via didn't respond immediately. He could feel her studying him again, that same measured assessment she had been making since the moment he broke her chains. Finally, she spoke. Why did you do it? He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He had expected this question, but that didn't mean he had a good answer. Because it was the right thing to do, he said. And it wasn't a lie. Her expression didn't change, but her tail twitched slightly, curling and uncurling in a slow, deliberate motion. That's not an answer, she said, and there was something sharp in her tone. Now something testing. Jeremy exhaled, leaning back against his seat. Because I couldn't stand there and do nothing, he admitted. Because I've seen enough of this galaxy to know how it works. People like those slavers, they get away with it because everyone looks the other way, because it's easier, safer. I'm not a hero, Via. I'm not a fighter, but I wasn't going to be one of them. She studied him for a long moment before turning back toward the viewport. That was reckless, she said finally. Jeremy let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, I get that a lot. Another silence stretched between them, but this one felt different, not quite as tense, not quite as guarded. He wasn't sure if that meant anything, but at least she wasn't threatening to kill him anymore. The ship's console beeped suddenly, drawing his attention. He frowned, flipping a few switches to bring up the display. His stomach twisted at what he saw. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. Vila turned her gaze toward him. We've got a problem, he said, tapping at the screen. There's a tracking beacon hidden in the ship systems. Those bastards must have planted it before we took off for the first time since their escape. Va tensed her tail, snapping against the side of her chair in irritation. Then they're already coming. Jeremy didn't argue. He had spent enough time in the underbelly of the galaxy to know that slavers never let go of a prize without a fight. They weren't just tracking them, they were already in pursuit. He worked quickly, fingers flying over the console, scanning for the signal's origin. It was buried deep, hidden in the ship's navigation corp, likely designed to route pings through different comm relays to avoid easy detection. Smart, but not smart enough. I can get rid of it, he said, standing abruptly, but I need to pull the panel under the cockpit and manually cut the connection. Va stood as well, already moving. Show me. Jeremy blinked, caught off Garred by the sudden shift in her demeanor. "You don't have to. I am not some helpless cargo." She cut in sharply, her eyes burning with something fierce. "If they are coming for me, I will not sit and wait like prey." Jeremy held her gaze. For a moment before nodding, he knelt, prying open the maintenance panel beneath the console, revealing the tangled mess of old wiring and rusted circuits beneath the beacon. "Embedded in here somewhere," he explained. "It'll be wired directly into the ship's power relay. We need to find it and sever the connection before it sends another ping." VA crouched beside him, her movements fluid despite the confined space. Jeremy had worked with plenty of people over the years, but he had never seen someone move the way she did. Every motion was deliberate, efficient, as if she had already mapped out her next 10 steps. Before even beginning, it was a stark contrast to the cold iron restraint she had worn only hours ago, he had no doubt. Now, whatever the galaxy had done to break the Zarian, they had failed. With her minutes passed in tense silence, as they worked, hands moving over the old circuitry, scanning for anything out of place. Then, just as Jeremy was beginning to wonder if they had been outmaneuvered, VA's tail flicked forward, curling around a bundle of wires. "There," she said. That one. Jeremy leaned in, eyes narrowing. Sure enough, a small metallic node was embedded between the circuits, its blinking red light barely noticeable against the mess of wiring. A transmitter. He grabbed the plasma cutter, glancing at her. "You sure?" She nodded once. "Do it." Jeremy didn't hesitate. The plasma cutter sparked to life, the small arc of heat slicing through the wires. In an instant, the beacons flickered once, then died. Silence. Jeremy exhaled, leaning back. "That should buy us time." Via didn't respond immediately. Her gaze lingered on the severed beacon, something unreadable in her expression. Then slowly she looked up at him. "They will still come," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less certain. Jeremy nodded. "I know." Another pause. Then, for the first time since they had met, V's tail brushed lightly against his arm, a barely their touch fleeting and unintentional, a gesture of acknowledgement of something neither of them had words for yet. "We should go," she said. Jeremy nodded again, and for the first time they moved together. The hum of the ship's aging engines filled the small cockpit as Jeremy recalibrated their course, fingers moving with practiced efficiency over the cracked control panel. The tracking beacon was gone, severed before it could betray their location again. But he knew that didn't mean they were safe. If anything, it only bought them time that was running out far too fast. Slavers were relentless. They had resources, informants, and a deep, insidious reach into every lawless sector of space. He had no illusions about what would happen if they were caught. They wouldn't just take Vale back. They would make an example out of both of them. He stole a glance at her as she sat beside him, her violet gaze locked on the endless expanse of space beyond the viewport. She had been silent for a while now, not in the distant way she had been before, but in the way someone carefully measured every thought before deciding what to say. Her tail was uncoiled now, resting lightly against the seat, no longer bound in cruel iron. He hadn't failed to notice the way she still tested it, small subconscious movements, as if part of her still didn't believe it was real. He didn't blame her if he had spent his whole life in chains. He wasn't sure he'd be able to accept their absence so quickly either. "You don't have a plan, do you?" she asked. Suddenly, her voice smooth, but edged with something sharp, something wary. Jeremy smirked, though it was half-hearted at best. "That obvious?" She didn't smile. "You risked your life to free me. You disabled the tracker, but you have nowhere to go." He let out his slow breath, fingers drumming against the console. "I know a few places," he admitted. "Outposts, backwater stations, places where people like us can disappear if we're careful." She turned her head slightly, fixing him with that unnerving gaze. "You are not like me." He hesitated at that, choosing his next words carefully. "No, maybe not, but I'm a wanted man now, just like you, so unless you've got a better plan, we stick together, at least for now." Another silence stretched between them, though this time it felt different. She wasn't dismissing him, she was considering him. "Vori," she said at last. Jeremy frowned. "What Vori?" "It's an old world abandoned. After the last war, most of the system is dead, just drifting stations and wreckage. It is a graveyard no one visits." Willingly, she exhaled slowly, as if she hated speaking the words aloud. "Gians used to call it home before the war. Some still hide there." Jeremy studied her, searching for the hesitation, the uncertainty. There was none. You think your people will take you, and a bitter smirk flickered across her lips. But it didn't reach her eyes. They may not even exist anymore. He could tell she didn't believe the words, not fully. If she thought there was a chance, no matter how small, that anyone was still out there, she had to take it. And for what it was worth, he understood. He didn't hesitate. Then we go to Vori. The journey was a quiet one, but not uncomfortable. Vee spoke little, but she watched everything. She moved with the silent efficiency of someone who had spent her entire life reading people, anticipating danger before it struck. At first she had kept to herself, only watching him with that careful, measured gaze. But the more time passed, the more she seemed to accept his presence, if not fully trusted. Jeremy found himself watching her too. Not just the way she carried herself, but the subtle things, the way her fingers always hovered near her belt, the way her tail twitched when she was lost and fought, the way her shoulders tensed whenever he stepped too close. She had spent her entire life expecting betrayal. He knew it would take more than a broken chain to undo that. He wasn't sure why it bothered him so much. "You are not a fighter," she said one evening, breaking the silence between them. Jeremy glanced up from where he was recalibrating the ship's secondary thruster. "That's supposed to be an insult." She tilted her head slightly as if considering it. "And OB observation, humans do not survive long in the outer rim without learning how to fight." He set his tools down, rolling his shoulder to ease the ache that had settled there. "I've gotten by. I know my way around a blaster, just never had to be on the run before." She leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed over her chest. "Then you are learning quickly." Jeremy chuckled. "Necessity is a hell of a teacher." She said nothing for a long moment, then unexpectedly asked, "Why are you out here in the rim?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Wasn't much left for me back home. Grew up on a mining colony, middle of nowhere. Spent my life fixing ships, welding panels, patching things together, just to keep them running for another week. Eventually got tired of watching the people around me work themselves to death for a system that didn't give a damn. So I left." V's gaze remained steady. "And you ended up here in the slaver markets." He exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, not exactly the heroic origin story." She studied him, and for the first time there was something almost thoughtful in her expression. "It is more honest than most." He met her gaze, and for the briefest moment something unspoken passed between them. Then the proximity alarm blared. Jeremy shot to his feet, moving to the console in an instant, eyes scanning the incoming readings. The pit in his stomach deepened as the display updated. "Ships, 3 of them. Looks like we've got company," he muttered, hands flying over the controls. VA was already moving her tail, flicking in agitation as she studied the readings. "Can you outrun them?" Jeremy grimaced. "Not in this rust bucket." She didn't hesitate. "Then we fight." He turned to her, ready to argue, but stopped when he saw her expression. There was no fear there, only certainty. "Do you even know how to fly a ship?" he asked. "No," she admitted, "but I know how to kill." Jeremy sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, I figured." The ships drew closer, the lead vessel locking onto their position. A transmission came through, the voice on the other end crackling with static. "Unidentified vessel powered down. Your engines. You are in restricted airspace." Jeremy didn't need to hear the rest. "Slavers." Vila didn't flinch. "They will not take me alive." Jeremy tightened his grip on the controls. "They won't take either of us." He threw the ship into evasive maneuvers. Just as the first shot was fired, the battle had begun. The ship lurched violently as the first plasma bolt struck the aft shields, sending a shudder through the cockpit as Jeremy fought to keep them steady. The rusted old hauler wasn't built for combat, and every alarm in the console blared its protest as the system struggled to compensate for the impact. He gritted his teeth, hands flying over the controls, forcing the sluggish vessel into a sharp dive as another barrage struck past them, lighting up the void with streaks of searing blue. Vey had moved with him the moment the first shot was fired. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She was already strapping herself into the weapons console, her tuck curling around the seat's armrest for stability as her hands moved over the unfamiliar controls. Jeremy had no idea if she had ever been behind a ship's guns before, but something told him it didn't matter. She was built for war, and the moment the opportunity came, she would meet it head-on. "They're trying to box us in." Jeremy growled, jerking the ship hard to the right to avoid the next volley. The 3 ships chasing them weren't just random scavengers, these were slaver hunters professionals, and they were coordinating with ruthless precision. They had seen the ship escape from VOR call, and they had been waiting for the right moment to strike. Vea's eyes flicked over the targeting display, reading it faster than he expected to. Light interceptors, 1 heavy craft. The larger one is their command ship. It has the strongest shields. Figures. Jeremy let out a harsh breath, checking the power reserves. The ship shields were already down to 70%, and if they took another direct hit, it would only get worse. I don't suppose you know how to work those guns. She didn't answer immediately, but when she did, her voice was cool. Steady, point, and kill. Jeremy snorted despite himself. Something like that. She said nothing else. A second later, the ship's rear turret roared to life, spitting out a burst of high-energy rounds as Vea took control. The slaver interceptors veered sharply, their pilots caught off guard by the sudden retaliation. One of the smaller ships took a direct hit to its forward shielding, causing a cascade of sparks. As its deflect struggled to hold, it didn't go down, but it was enough to break their tight formation, forcing them to reposition. Jeremy took the opening and dove, pulling them into a tight spiral as he weaved through the debris field of a long-forgotten battle. Wreckage drifted in every direction, twisted remnants of ships that had met their end long before they arrived. It was dangerous, but he was betting that the slavers wouldn't risk flying through it at full speed. You said you weren't a fighter, V noted, her voice calm even as she tracked the next target. I'm not, Jeremy shot back, banking hard to the left as a charred hole fragment spun dangerously close. But I am a damn good pilot. She didn't argue. Instead, she fired again. This time the rounds connected with the second interceptor, shredding through its left wing. The slaver ship spiraled out of control, flames bursting from its engine vents as it careened straight into a floating wreck. There was a brief blinding explosion, and then only dust. Jeremy didn't have time to celebrate the lead ship. The heavy one was still on them, and it was far more dangerous than the smaller crafts had been. Its weapons were built for disabling, not destroying. That meant they wanted to take the ship intact. That meant they still wanted to take Vey. Hang on, Jeremy warned, gripping the controls tighter as he pushed the ship into a reckless roll. The inertial dampeners strained under the sudden movement, and for a moment everything inside the cockpit was a blur of flashing lights and rattling panels. The heavy slaver ship stayed close behind, its ion cannons charging for another volley. Incoming, Vila shouted. Jeremy twisted the controls at the last second. The ship barely managed to evade the blast, but the shields took a glancing hit, sending a fresh burst of static through the console shields. At 35%, Jeremy muttered, scanning for anything he could use to turn the fight in their favor. We're not gonna last much longer. V's tail flicked sharply, her gaze locking onto something on the sensors there. Jeremy followed her line of sight and felt his breath catch. A Durrell battle cruiser loomed in the distance, its massive frame broken apart from whatever war had claimed it. Its skeletal remains drifted slowly, its interior completely dark, but its hull still held enough structure to serve as temporary cover. Jeremy grinned despite the danger. I like the way you think. He didn't waste time. He angled the ship toward the wreckage, diving into the ruined hulk with all the precision he could muster. The slaver ship followed, but they hesitated just enough to give him the edge. The moment they entered the shadow of the wreck, Jeremy killed the external lights and powered down the main thrusters, letting the ship drift. The sudden blackout threw off the slaver targeting sensors, forcing them to rely on manual tracking. Hold your fire, Jeremy whispered, watching the scanner as the enemy ship prowled just outside. They don't know where we are. Via remained still, her tail coiled tightly around the base of her seat as she watched the slaver ship through the viewport. Her breath was slow, controlled. The heavy ship drifted closer, its search lights scanning the wreckage, but it didn't fire. They were looking, hunting. Jeremy's fingers tightened around the controls. He had one shot, one chance to turn the tables. Vey, he murmured, on my mark, fire everything. We've got it. Their engines. She didn't question him. She simply nodded, her fingers hovering over the weapon systems. Jeremy counted down in his head. 3, 2, 1. He slammed the thrusters to full power. The ship roared back to life, bursting from the wreckage in a sudden explosion of motion. The slaver ship had no time to react. VA fired the twin cannons, unleashed a relentless barrage, slamming into the slaver ship's rear thrusters with pinpoint precision. The impact was immediate. The slaver ship lurched violently, its engines erupting into flames as critical systems failed. The chain reaction spread rapidly, sending fire and debris spewing in all directions. Jeremy didn't stay to watch. He threw the ship into maximum thrust, leaving the wreckage behind. As the slaver vessel sputtered and died in the darkness, the silence that followed was deafening. Only the hum of their ship remained. Jeremy exhaled slowly, his hands finally easing off the controls. "You all right?" VA stared at the viewport for a long moment before turning to him. There was something different in her gaze now. Not just caution, something else, something raw. "I am free," she said simply. Jeremy met her eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "You are." For the first time since they had met, she smiled. It was small, fleeting, but it was real, and for the first time, Jeremy realized he wasn't just running anymore. They were fighting together. The hum of the ship's engines had settled into a steady rhythm, a constant, soothing presence in the silence that filled the cockpit. Jeremy kept one hand on the controls, adjusting their trajectory as the sensors updated. But for the first time since their escape, they weren't being pursued. No slaver ships on their tail, no alarms blaring, no imminent threat hanging over them like a guillotine. It was almost unsettling. He had been running for so long that the absence of immediate danger felt unnatural, as if at any moment the universe would remember it. Had unfinished business with them. VA sat beside him as she had for the past several hours, her gaze locked on the viewport, watching the endless void stretch out before them. She hadn't spoken much since the battle, but she hadn't retreated into herself either. Instead, she seemed thoughtful, not wary, not tense, just lost in something internal. It was a change, however small, but Jeremy wasn't about to push. He had spent a lifetime in chains, and even now, free of them, she was still adjusting to what that meant. He exhaled quietly, stretching out his stiff fingers before speaking. "We should reach VOR in a few hours." She nodded slightly, but didn't look at him. "You do not have to take me there." Jeremy raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Do you think I went through all this trouble just to drop you off in the middle of nowhere?" Her tail flicked absently against the floor, a gesture he was beginning to recognize as a sign of contemplation. "You have no reason to help me," she said, voice even, but there was something beneath it, something restrained. "I am free now. You are no longer responsible for me." Jeremy scoffed. "I was never responsible for you." "There, you're not a straight. I picked up out of pity. I made a choice same as you, and right now my choice is to see this through." He glanced at her, watching her reaction carefully. "Unless you'd rather go somewhere else." She was quiet for a long moment, fingers tracing over the edge of the console. "No," she admitted. "Vori is what remains of my people. If there are any left, they will be there." Jeremy nodded, satisfied. "Then that's where we're going." More silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just there. And then softly, she asked why. He frowned, looking at her again. Why? What? Her gaze met his finely violet eyes, piercing. "Why are you helping me?" Jeremy let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. He had asked himself that same question more than once over the past few days. There had been no grand plan when he stepped into that slaver market. He hadn't been searching for a cause, hadn't been looking for a fight. And yet here he was, running from slavers, dodging death, heading toward a world that wasn't his own, all for a woman he had met by chance. The story continue next video.